Hello, everyone. On a day of sad and unsettling news on the world stage, we want to welcome you all to the third installment of our speaker series, Identity and Belonging in a Global Age, sponsored by the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition. I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU and co-director of the Center on Modernity in Transition.
And I'm Benjamin Schul, and together with Shahrzad, I direct the Center on Modernity and Transition. Questions of collective identity and belonging have surged to prominence in recent years. This speaker series brings together leading thinkers to examine the crises of identity that confront us in a rapidly changing global age, and to think deeply about how humanity might resolve these crises. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Rosenboim and Inés Valdez to discuss identity and alternative visions of world order.
Rosenboim is Senior Lecturer and Director of the Center for Modern History at the Department of International Politics at City University of London. She is the author of The Emergence of Globalism, Visions of World Order in Britain and the United States, 1939 to 1950. And Inés Valdez is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Ohio State University, where she also directs the Latino Studies program. She is the author of Transnational Cosmopolitanism, Kant, Du Bois, and Justice as a Political Craft. Inés, a very warm welcome to you both, and happy Black History Month to you and to our audience as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
So we normally like to begin our conversations on a more personal note, biographical even. So to start, I want to ask each of you to tell us a bit about the more personal pathways that have led you to think and write about the themes of our discussion today, namely identity and alternative visions of world order. Inés, maybe we can begin with you.
Sure, and I was really glad to see this question, and glad that you're asking it in this, as a context for this conversation, because the path to writing the book Transnational Cosmopolitanism was not the straight path, dissertation to book that usually takes place after one graduates, but rather it emerged not only from kind of a switch that took place after I arrived to the US in terms of my area of concentration, and then it emerged from and through a rethinking of what I did in my dissertation. So let me just say a bit about those two things very quickly. When I moved to the US in 2003 to pursue my PhD, I was really thinking about political economy and questions of development. And I was planning to do something critical about, I mean, you could think about it now in terms of how dependency and the new world economic order have really re-emerged as kind of an area of concern. But of course, this is not the case in other areas of political science, such as comparative politics. So I arrived and I saw that kind of the critical work that I wanted to do didn't really have a place in comparative politics. And long story short, I became a political theorist after taking this seminar on feminist theory that was very much engaged in critical political economy and as well as Black and Chicana feminism. And so this was kind of the path that took me first to political theory. And my engagement at that time was primarily with cosmopolitanism as I started my dissertation work, and very much within the Kantian tradition. And my frustration, later with the Kantian tradition, but at that moment with the political theory of migration itself, liberalism and cultural nationalists within this tradition in particular, had to do with the lack of engagement and awareness with structures of power and racialization that were, I think, in my opinion, core to understanding the politics of migration, but were nonetheless bracketed at that point. And of course, this has to do with having arrived to the US in the post 9/11 period. The Department of Homeland Security was founded in 2002. And so I arrived to the US from, being half Argentine and half Peruvian, to a very kind of charged and aggressive environment towards brown workers, brown migrants, which is kind of the core target of the Department of Homeland Security after it was created in 2002 in terms of the resources devoted to policing, detention, and deportation of these populations. And so this is kind of what moved me to study migration and to study cosmopolitanism. And as I graduated, I kind of deepened my critical engagement with the Kantian tradition and eventually returned to Du Bois as the right interlocutor to kind of really bring into the surface questions of race and questions of hierarchy in the international sphere. So kind of this is how I got to the Kant and Du Bois and justice as a political craft, so to speak.
Terrific, very stimulating. Or how about you? What were the personal experiences that led you to think about globalism, world order, and these kinds of themes?
So yeah, in a way, I share some of what Inés said in terms of my interest in cosmopolitanism. Started off during my BA in Bologna. And that was also mixed with the experience of migration. So I moved to Italy to pursue my undergrad degree. And then I moved again to the UK. And these kind of encounters made me think a lot about both my personal identity in this changing world and about the big questions of, what is world order? How do people even think about these kind of very vague and abstract terms? And I started to study kind of the history of political thought. But what happened is that I was mostly taught the kind of main canonical thinkers, and I didn't really identify with them as a person. So I didn't see people like me taught in the canon so much, and I was curious what less, let's say, famous or classical or great thinkers thought about world order, especially in the context of empire. That's another kind of let's say, perspective that I gained when I moved to the UK, that obviously in Italy was not particularly important, but in Oxford, everything is measured through empire. So all of these little components then made me think that the 1940s was a period that we really need to look back to understand this concept of world order and then the global. So why people imagine the world to be global in a politically significant way. And I kind of grew up or became, a thinking adult in a period when globalization was the buzzword, the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, everybody wanted to be globalized. Mm-hmm. It still had this charm without very much the kind of critical edge that nowadays we associate with it. So that made me think that the global was something that was both appealing, but perhaps dangerous. Maybe it has a kind of a dark side that needs to be exposed. And I must say that, obviously, if we think about the kind of experience of migrants, my own is probably a privileged one, being a white person and in the end having had access to education, etc. But many of the thinkers they ended up writing about were emigres and refugees, and had to move countries and reconsider their whole careers because of historical changes, transformations on which they had no influence. So this is also something I was interested in. How do people think about world order when their own personal world was shattered by these kind of events? So I think this made it more urgent for me to understand, and that led to this book essentially. Alongside other explorations that I've undertaken since then, in an attempt to look at the less explored people and to see why their ideas about world order still matter today.
It's really interesting. Thank you both for sharing some of that more personal background and personal history with us. The notion of the global is hotly debated today, and in different ways, both your books delve into some of the discourse and debate that surrounded the idea of the global in the last century, specifically in the middle decades of the 20th century. So I want to start by asking you to tell us about the core arguments you advance in your books. Or you examine the emergence of what you call globalism in visions of world order that were proposed in Britain and the United States during and immediately following the Second World War. In particular, your book examines a transnational network of thinkers and public intellectuals who, driven by a sense of epochal crisis during World War II, propose a range of new and alternative schemes of global order. And the account that you give complicates in various ways the history of mid-20th century political thought, perhaps most notably by stepping outside the usual preoccupations with the state and with national sovereignty that typically pervade intellectual histories of that period. As you put it, globalism emerged from an awareness of the political significance of the globe as a unitary whole made of interconnected, diverse political units. So, or I want to ask you, what were some of the visions of world order that emerged out of this mid-20th century globalism that you describe? What was distinctive about them? And which of them do you, for better or for worse, find yourself most attracted to intellectually today?
Right. So the book, as you say, traces this idea of the global, but it does so in following a kind of a scale or a scalar order. So I try to resist the notion that the global excluded any other scale of political order. And actually what I argue is that the global just made people rethink all the other units that exist in the political structure. So the book follows these different units from the smallest one of the state to regional orders, federations, and finally the kind of entire world. And it shows how political thinkers imagined each of these units, reimagine them in the context of the global. So for example, I look at how David Mitrani tried to overcome the primacy of the state by creating a kind of a functional network of supranational organizations that were supposed to address people's needs and to be apolitical. So he assumed that some of the things we need in life, such as health or healthcare or transportation or other kind of services are not political, and there could be some kind of an alternative system that would address them, regardless of the terrible ideologies of nationalism that he blamed for the war. So this was one way to kind of weave the states in a different structure that would take away the kind of negative contribution of nationalism. Another vision that I found more appealing was a regional order. So what kind of big scale order could be imagined, especially in Asia? And I was very attracted by the figure of Owen Lattimore, who was this expert of China, and he had hands-on experience of living in the Great Steppe in Mongolia and places very remote that people didn't really know. And based on this experience, he developed a political theory of anti-imperialism and republicanism. And he imagined a kind of freedom bloc, as he called it. So it was supposed to be a regional order in Asia led by a democratic China before, obviously, the Chinese Revolution of '49. So this was a vision that really tried to resist the European imperialism by suggesting a system of political rule from below by people who actually know the land and its particularities. And I found that quite innovative for its time. So he proposed the Chinese century instead of the American century that Henry Luce obviously is famed for. Finally, I was appealed, but maybe not in a good way, by, I was really attracted to this idea of the world constitution that the Chicago Committee tried to create, especially because, you know, as an academic, I was impressed by their dedication to this project. So these people met for 2 years, every month for a whole weekend, trying to write a world constitution. And what is interesting for me in this project is not really the final constitution that they published, but the discussions behind it. So I find it a bit, perhaps I could say, even intellectually endearing, that they were aware of all the limitations of their project, that it was Western-centric, and it didn't actually have representation from Africa or from the colonial parts of the world, that it was idealistic and difficult to realize, and that their vision was not really shared by the people they were trying to convince. But at the same time, I find that this kind that humanities scholars have a sense of responsibility to engage with the world and to envisage a new world order is something that shouldn't be excluded from the contemporary debate. So I think perhaps now, in view of what's going on in Ukraine and other places, people with the knowledge could at least, consider their responsibility to dedicate some of their time and efforts to thinking about the real problems of the world.
Right. Thank you, Ora, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. Inés, building on the writing and activism of W.E.B. Du Bois, you make the case for a different, or for an expanded intellectual history, and for a correspondingly different conception of the global and the cosmopolitan. Specifically, you argue that genuinely cosmopolitan visions of political order emerge out of the transnational solidarity and political action of marginalized groups around the world, operating outside the traditional spheres of domestic and international politics from which they're excluded. What is the vision of the global and the cosmopolitan that your work brings into focus? And how does it differ from that of more conventional neo-Kantian cosmopolitan accounts in political philosophy, as well as from some of the mid-century globalist visions that Or has elaborated?
Thank you. So, I mean, this conversation is so interesting just because, as we were mentioning in the practice session, there are so many ways in which I see kind of the account that Or is giving us as the very interlocutors that Du Bois was kind of had in mind when he was trying to argue for a different globalism. So, as you mentioned, my account of transnational cosmopolitanism amends Kantian and neo-Kantian views of the cosmopolitan by bringing into view, as you said, transnational solidarity and emancipatory political action by marginalized groups who were also racialized and excluded from the traditional spheres at the international level. So very much from the spheres that perhaps the Chicago group that was drafting this world constitution kind of was also kind of envisioning. So for that reason, the vision of the global that these groups put forward is substantially different in the sense that it really tries to kind of offer almost a different temporality, right? I mean, we know, I mean, in traditional conceptions of the public sphere, temporality, a common sense of temporality is central, I mean, for grounding different political actors around a project. And I think that it's important to note how the very temporality that oriented these alliances of anti-colonial activists was quite different in the sense that it viewed this trajectory of modernity that was seen as the age of industrialization and expansion and technology, as Or also addresses, and instead saw this period as one of regression, right? I mean, one of colonialism, invasion, and really destruction of whole ways of life. So really, kind of a moment of tragedy. So I think this is quite important, kind of, to distinguish these two. I mean, I call them public spheres in the book, and I refer to an anti-colonial public sphere that kind of reorients this temporality, kind of rewrites in a way the history of modernity. And so, and I mean, the way in which I trace this sphere is through, I mean, not only the exchanges between intellectuals in the colonies, in particular, I mean, in Gandhi, as well as members of the Ghadar party, that some of them exiled in New York. So there's a way in which I'm really thinking about the global, but it's a global that is very much grounded, right? I mean, if you think about New York in the 1920s or the 1930s, I mean, this was a multicultural assemblage of anti-colonial activists, Caribbean exiles, so exiles from the British Empire, as well as Indian anti-colonial activists, many of them eventually deported because there were close networks of collaboration between Canada, the US, and Britain that were after this revolutionary element, so to speak. And so it is global, but it's at the same time very grounded in the sense that it was these encounters between actors that were variously located and came from different, they were, as Du Bois, they were descendants of Black slaves in the US, or they were actual colonial subjects coming from the Caribbean or from India, coming together and really finding this sense of commonality that created what I call this anti-colonial public sphere, but more generally that gave a transnational underpinning for cosmopolitanism. So not cosmopolitanism as an abstract global community, but as a very grounded one made up of these transnational connections. So this is where my critique of Kant's cosmopolitanism is grounded as well. Although in the book I start with Kant, criticize Kant, and then move on to Du Bois, one can read it the other way around as well, because what Kant was trying to do in his political writings, in particular in Perpetual Peace and then the Doctrine of Right, is to really rescue a European society, which he thought was the most civilized society, or the most civilized region in the world, from the violence of colonial wars. And I think it's quite interesting how Kant's critique of colonialism has been, at least, in the 1990s and then 2000s, until this broader conversation about Kant and colonialism emerges. But his colonial critique was read quite literally to say, well, here's a critique of colonialism that we can use to think about global justice today. But what I think happens in Perpetual Peace in particular is that he is, of course, concerned with colonial violence, but not because of trying to understand the political agency of those who are resisting or trying to problematize these hierarchies. I don't dispute that he condemns this violence, but there is also a very important way in which he's really afraid of what this violence is going to do to European civilization and its ability to to maintain its trajectory towards republics at the domestic level, and then gradually towards a world federation at the international level. And this critique also extends to neo-Kantians, to the extent that, to some extent, they do, as I mentioned, take his critique to be a true cosmopolitan concern, as opposed to a more limited kind of Eurocentric view, Eurocentric in the simple sense that he was concerned about Europe, its stability, and the progress of its civilization. And as a consequence, what happens is that oftentimes you see in some of these writings this idea that the European Union in particular appears as a model for others to follow, without kind of considering the way in which these same agents were very much behind the colonial injustice that the rest of the world is more interested in kind of problematizing and politicizing as the problem to be overcome, even in our times. And so swept under the carpet of this cosmopolitan account are questions of uneven economic relations, as well as how this unevenness operates dynamically, demarcating the world, but also determining racism against diasporas in the metropole, right? So it's something that is both kind of global, but also kind of grounded in London, in the US, in unequal relations between Mexico and the United States, etc. But I want to move to responding to the second part of your question, vis-a-vis and also kind of engaging with Orr's stimulated reconstruction of globalism in the mid-20th century. So beyond kind of very much recognizing these interlocutors in terms of what Du Bois was addressing, I think the overlaps and tensions are really quite productive. Of course, empire, the global meaning of democracy, as well as pluralism, which Orr characterizes as the three kind of features of this globalism that she reconstructs. These were the themes that were orienting Du Bois in his interventions. But again, I would kind of, I guess perhaps the best way to conceptualize the tension would be to say that pluralism kind of does not do enough work. I mean, pluralism and diversity is not the same as difference and domination, right? And so I think that would be the way in which perhaps the pluralism of the globalisms that Orr reconstructs can be contrasted with the transnationalism that Du Bois kind of puts forward. And that is one that, yes, I mean, there's racial difference, but this racial difference is leveraged in the service of domination. And the recognition of diversity is not enough to counter these structures.
So, Inés, maybe we can continue on this theme, but shift a little to talking about identity more directly. And I think really one of the interesting things about your research is how you show that the emergence of these transnational identities between Black Americans and various colonial movements around the world, and really the crucial role that this kind of new formation played in stimulating emancipatory political action in the post-World War II era, as well as to the emergence of alternative global political imagination, as you say. So this focus on identity in your work strikes me as being distinctive. I mean, in many ways, it contrasts with the rhetoric in most cosmopolitan literature and political theory, which tends to assume that kind of particular identities, they are sort of an impediment to projects of global justice or to cosmopolitan order. And so for you, you seem to argue, in fact, the opposite, that these particular identities were, in fact, agents, stimulating agents of global justice and sort of visions of cosmopolitan order. So how in your own research did you see these identities of particular groups of people who are suffering with particular acts of oppression and injustice and marginalization? How did their identities play a constructive unifying role in creating a vision of a more just world order, rather than inhibiting the attempt to envision kind of a cosmopolitan order or kind of a new framework for world order?
Thank you. So, I mean, I like this question because this was one of the hardest part of the book to write, because, as we all do, perhaps when we write a book or we write, period, I mean, you start thinking, okay, is this really possible? Is this really kind of correct? Can I really kind of make this argument? Because precisely what you were saying, in the cosmopolitan literature, identity is kind of very generally considered an impediment to cosmopolitanism, to solidarity, and so on and so forth. But so let me start with kind of two excerpts from one from Du Bois' autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, from the 1950s, and then his much earlier Conservation of Races, which has kind of elicited a lot of debate within philosophy. Just because there is something in Du Bois' notion of identity that leaves a space for politics, right? So it's not an identity as a pre-political construct, but very much a political construct. So let me just kind of read those two excerpts and then kind of say why I find them kind of helpful and very productive politically, rather than kind of thinking about identity as an obstacle. And so the first one, which actually comes later, is from Dusk of Dawn, and says, so he's talking about his affinity with Africa, and he says, "But one thing is sure, and that is the fact that since the 15th century, these ancestors of mine and their other descendants have suffered a common disaster and have a long memory. But the physical bond is least, and the badge of color relatively unimportant, save as a badge. The real essence of this kinship is its social heritage of slavery, the discrimination and insult, and this heritage extends through Yellow Asia and the South Seas. I think it is this unity that draws me to Africa." And then comes this other definition of race in the Conservation of Races, where he argues that a race is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of a certain, more or less vividly conceived ideals of life. And so the first quote talks about this idea of the common disaster as the real essence of kinship. So it's not blood, it's just a historical account of common experiences, and in particular experiences of oppression. He talks about an insult, right? And then the second one very much seems to go for a very kind of, in a way, racial or kind of traditional identitarian account, only to later say, well, I mean, this might be involuntary. There may be kind of strivings that are involuntarily kind of convergent, right? And so this is what I really like kind of in the way in which Du Bois talks about identity, because it really opens the door to think about identity as a political construction. And it also suggests that there is the possibility of expanding our imagination through kind of identitarian loyalties or solidarities. But what emerges is a sort of kinship that is really not based on common belonging to a religion, to a race, or to a particular national community, but really grounded in political and historical conjunctures. And so, I mean, of course, this requires a hard work of coalition making, communication, investigation of the very causes that bring these groups together, but it's nonetheless kind of a form of identification and loyalty that we usually kind of connect to identity proper. And so vis-a-vis how cosmopolitanism thinks about identity, I think the particularism problem is not endemic to the notion of identity, but it's actually dependent on what identity claims are meant to do politically. And so this is quite clear in the solidarity tradition that I build upon, in particular Tommy Shelby's and then Juliet Hooker's amendment of Tommy Shelby's account of solidarity. And so Juliet not only makes clear that individuals can experience multiple relations of solidarity and even may have to kind of negotiate between tensions in these relations of solidarity, but also that the mutual trust and identification emerges out of joint political work, right? And so, yeah, and so this is basically what I then call in Du Bois the political craft. How do we see him? I mean, through his interventions, through his connections, through his travel, crafting politically a new transnational identity. And conversely, I think, and I finish with this, that in the cosmopolitan tradition, when Habermas in particular, that I address quite a bit in my book, when he thinks about identity, I mean, his kind of biographical kind of history is very much attached to the two world wars and national identities, right? Identities attached to a nation. And the concern is, of course, understandably about their exclusionary character. But of course, what's ironic is that these identities had to be carefully constructed in order to uproot other forms of loyalty. So there was the common language, education, and so on and so forth. But once we're writing after the Second World War, that is forgotten, and it's assumed that this national identity is, or that, so because national identities are problematic and exclusivist and potentially xenophobic, they that kind of takes identity out of question to the cart. And so, if in contrast, instead of thinking about that trajectory of identities, you think about the trajectory that I trace in Du Bois, what you really see is the way in which the very well-known double consciousness becomes throughout the 20s and 30s a multiple transnational identity. You see this political work actually exiting the space of the nation state, but nonetheless remaining a question of identity and loyalties and mutual identification, but with subjects abroad.
Also, building off this, very stimulating analysis of the interrelation between political craft and identity, I wanted to turn to you, Or, because in your own research, you show how, whether at the level of thought or at action, that the supposedly all-encompassing global sphere that many mid-century British and American intellectuals envisioned was actually far more exclusionary than they had initially understood. You describe how, for example, despite their often explicit anti-imperialist aspirations, the globalist conversations in Britain and the United States tended to remain quite separate from real, concrete anti-colonial struggles and movements throughout the world. You also note how race and race relations were not a major concern of these kind of more mainstream globalist thinkers. So perhaps you can say a bit more about the sources of these omissions. To what extent were they, for example, influenced by a more pragmatic, strategic desire to influence certain prominent discourses or institutions that were at the time less receptive to burgeoning anti-colonial or racially egalitarian ideals? Or inversely, to what extent were the thinkers you studied firmly enmeshed in the colonial and racially hierarchical frameworks of thought and political action that were still quite prominent at that time?
Thank you. So this question is something that I've debated with a lot with myself, in the sense that the collection of thinkers at the core of my study is essentially mostly elite white men. And this is obviously a question of selection. And I've chosen them for one reason. They were all connected in a kind of a transnational network of people talking in a kind of common conversation on the same subject. Almost all of them had experience of migration, or they were refugees or travelers at least. But as I went on during the quite blind to what Inés now mentioned as this kind of relations of power and domination that they and their countries were complicit in. So in a sense, their vision of pluralism, that they hoped would be global and in that sense transcend and overcome the kind of totalitarian ideologies that were the source of all evil. So this pluralism was in a sense blind to the entire structure of power that framed their own societies and that often relied on racial categories. So this is something that I was interested in. In a sense, a lot of them had a strong notion of justice and global justice, and they sought to engage a wider audience and to create a kind of a better world in which people would be truly free and equal. But this engagement did not necessarily include a direct conversation with people from other parts of the world that we would nowadays consider as really the first step towards a true change. You know, it's nowadays it seems it's like having a manual, you know, just a whole men panel talking about feminism. Is this okay? I'm not sure. So we would tend to think no. And you see that was quite, that went without any comment in some circles. But I was also impressed by some people's awareness of these limitations at the time and their inability to overcome them. And this is something that is also, I think, important to think about, the kind of sociology of knowledge perspective of the development of the global idea. So the Chicago Committee that united to write this world constitution after the Second World War, they constantly referred to the need to implement a kind of African perspective on world constitution, a Soviet perspective of how we can unite the world, but they didn't actually do it. So they knew that something was completely partial and limited in their project, but they were unable to correct it. And I think this is a distinct development of the 1940s in comparison with the interwar years that I've previously explored, when these matters largely passed completely unnoticed. So in the 40s, they noticed the problem of race relations, but they were unable to see how to resolve it because they were blind to the problems of power. And obviously not everyone. So Inés shows very well that in some other circles in New York and in London, people were strongly aware of the source of the discrimination and the oppression, but not in these circles. So what I'm interested in is essentially to show what the elite thought. What did people think when they were trying to come up with visions that they thought could be realized? So none of these people actually planned in a utopian manner. They did not just think vaguely about, an ideal world. They all sought to create something that could be implemented, and they had the connections to the policy world. And this is, I think, instructive for thinking about the global, not just in the 40s, but also today. So the limitations of global thinking are, I think, strongly connected to the ability or inability to notice the power relations that actually define the political structure of the global. And those who did note the power relations, like Owen Lattimore, for example, who sought to resist European imperialism with a different set of values based on democracy and freedom, and grounded in a tradition that was distinctly anti-European, the Chinese kind of a cultural hub. He ended up being pursued by McCarthy and excluded from public debate in the United States. He had to leave his prominent academic position in Johns Hopkins, and eventually he relocated to Leeds in the United Kingdom, so far away from the center of decision making and so on. So this is the kind of trajectory that shows you also.
Or you're cutting out.
The kind of power relations and. Sorry.
Could you repeat that last
point
now? You cut. You've been cutting out just a little bit. You said it shows. Okay. I just want to.
Yeah.
Make
So
sure
it shows the risk of talking about these power relations, and I think that it wasn't the price that everyone was ready to pay. So a lot of the thinkers that I've discussed, including Raymond Aron, Barbara Wooten, Jacques Maritain, they all tended to just avoid talking about these crucial topics because they knew that these could be career making or breaking. And in that sense, I think we should be aware of ignoring the context around the history of these ideas. It's not just about thinking in, empty space. Some ideas had, crucial personal consequences for people, and this is why they were avoided in many ways, and perhaps still are today.
Inés, did you want to comment on that? You're muted.
I find it quite interesting in the sense that, this is definitely the very same period. My book doesn't cover so much in the 40s and 50s, but of course, Du Bois was also prosecuted. His passport was confiscated, and this emerged from his participation in so-called peace societies, right? And so all of this, I can actually, it's quite interesting that, even positions of privilege at that time weren't sheltered from, in this case in particular, anti-communism and the Red Scare. At the same time, I can't help thinking about, Du Bois's kind of continuous complaints about efforts to shift discussions about globalism, and particularly shift discussions about peace. And this is mostly earlier, around the turn of the century. The inability of interlocutors who are globalists and who are, very committed peace activists to consider the question of colonialism at all as a question having to do with peace, right? And so at the turn of the century, it's quite interesting because there's a discussion about 100 years of peace between, in particular, the United States and Great Britain. And so what Du Bois is trying to say, there is no peace. There is violence. There's continuous violence within the imperial possessions of these two countries. So why are we going to celebrate this peace when it's not indicative of wider I don't want to say stability, but of wider political. Peace and political progress. So, and I also, there's, some of the responses that I got when I was putting together the conversation between Du Bois and Kant was of course, why are you putting these two in conversation? Why aren't you writing a book on Kant, or why aren't you writing a book on Du Bois? And one thing that I always kept coming back to is the way in which Du Bois was very, very insistent in addressing all kinds of realms. And in particular, he was, he wrote letters to presidents, to ambassadors. And so this was something that he was quite invested in. And so when I get to read these kind of other accounts of historical political thought, I see kind of really how little, it's not completely generalized, but how little he managed to really make these topics of broader interest, despite the fact that they were both living in a very kind of charged environment, particularly in the 50s, where critique was quite difficult. So yeah, I think I would say that.
I want to ask you both to further explore for us the tension between the universal and the particular that has been running through our conversation. Inés, your work illuminates the relationship of the particular to the universal by bringing to it the perspective of those at the margins of empire, as you put it. In one passage of your book, Transnational Cosmopolitanism, you articulate what I think is a very significant point in this connection. You write, "The fact that Du Bois is the core source of my inquiry and the perspective of Black Americans and colonial peoples is central in his work does not mean this is a vernacular project. Attending to those subjects and instances of domination that are not intelligible in the standard notion of universality is necessary because the emancipation of those subjects constitutes the very possibility of universality." So I want to ask you first to elaborate for us how this emancipation constitutes, as you put it, a genuine universality. And second, how do we ensure that there's room in this emancipatory universalism for all human beings, regardless of where they might be situated in our past and present structures of domination?
Thank you. This is, again, a really excellent question. And I will start by saying that this insight is grounded on Du Bois himself. And the way in which he, tirelessly highlights throughout the years that it is only when those at the very lowest ranks of society or of the world are emancipated can we really assert the reality of universal or freedom or universality. And this theme of course, still today very present in Black feminist thought and the tradition of intersectionality, right? That these two groups really make clear how waves of emancipation leave behind those who are multiply oppressed, right? So waves of emancipation that address questions of race, questions of gender are not complete. And as such, if we think about universality as the effort of freeing or of extending egalitarian relations to the universe, these very groups, the ones that fall at the intersection of oppressions, in particular, need to be considered as kind of a crucial, as almost the precondition for universality, right? And so the problem is really how notions of equality and freedom presuppose a universality or a universal subject that is really posited abstractly. And so this effort by Du Bois and by Black feminists and intersectionality theories is to precisely posit how flawed this abstract universal subject is, or not flawed, but actually incomplete or not universal at all. And I think, this is very, this particular critique of universality is very prominent in Du Bois' 1915 essay, The African Roots of War, that is really present at the beginning of my account of Du Bois, but it has become even more central in the book that I'm currently finishing. And so this particular piece that is published in Foreign Affairs, if I'm not mistaken, really looks at Anglo-American democracies and recasts them as imperial democracies, right? So what he says is, there's this sense in general discourse in Europe and the US that democracy is advancing, and that it's almost inevitable. It's a wave, right? There's this sense of inevitability. But he says, well, it is only inevitable if you think about this very narrow kind of group of people, namely the white working class in Europe and the United States. And then he says, well, no, there's nothing natural or progressive about this expansion because it is going to hit a wall. And this wall is, for Du Bois, the color line. And so this clash, what Du Bois is trying to kind of to argue against is to make these sweeping claims about democracy and about freedom and about emancipation that have characterized most of Enlightenment thinking and was characterizing kind of this sense of change at the beginning of the 20th century. And so Du Bois was very clear that such universality had a potentially universal application, but that depended on how how those groups that were kind of struggling for their emancipation kind of resignified those claims of emancipation. So he has a wonderful, very short essay called Americanization, in which Du Bois invites all non-Anglo immigrants, so non-Anglo white immigrants, to join Black Americans in their struggle against this Anglo imperialism that has been kind of transplanted into the United States. So he's saying, do not assimilate into the oppressor, join us, kind of just as you are racialized and discriminated and are tied to kind of traditional religions and so on and so forth. So there is a way in which there's a politics of universality that is that Du Bois is trying to conceptualize here, in the sense that, it depends on how those universal claims kind of become material in everyday political action. And of course, what he sees is, and this is particularly clear in oh my God, his 1934 book on Black Reconstruction. So his Black Reconstruction book is very clear that the white working class takes up these ideas of emancipation and applies them to themselves and refuses to let them apply to others. In fact, almost their emancipation, and this is kind of what I'm working on right now, so it's very present in my mind, this emancipation is actually predicated on the continuous oppression of both colonial subjects and racialized workers in the US, right? Because they want a piece of that imperial kind of booty or pie, right? This is what their emancipation requires the continued oppression of the others. And so this is kind of, I guess I'm answering the question by showing what is not universality, right? Not universality is taking these ideas of freedom and emancipation and putting them to work in order to protect a particular group from oppression while maintaining the oppression of others. And I think so. Then to think about more in a universal kind of key, I guess the question that Du Bois is posing is, what if Italians and Germans and Eastern Europeans had joined Black Americans in their struggle, as opposed to attempted to assimilate? And that's kind of where you envision this possibility of universality. There would have been an opportunity to envision a form of society that would not have built its existence and well-being on the backs of African slaves, or on the backs of their descendants, or on the backs of Indian and Chinese indentured migrants that came in very vulnerable positions to the US, Canada, Australia, etc. So it is in that sense that centering the position and the perspective of the marginalized really clues us into kind of these moments in which universality is both posited and curtailed. And I've been reading as well for my second project. I've been reading up on indigenous political thinkers such as Glenn Coulthard, Jody Byrd, and Robin Kimmerer, and diaspora settler thinkers like Wen Yang and others. And I think that I found this extremely helpful, to further clarify this idea of how do we construct a universalism that can incorporate, that doesn't have to be curtailed, that doesn't hit that wall, so to speak. And I'll finish with this. But what is quite interesting is that there's been an effort to think about, at the very beginning, there's been, you can think about some indigenous political thought thinking in terms of settlers and everyone else. And then there's this triad in which we think about settlers and slaves indigenous, and then everyone else is settlers. That's what I meant to say. And then there's an effort to think about this triad, which is settler, slave, and indigenous. And I think what recent indigenous political thought, in particular the work of Kimmerer, have really made clear that once these same immigrants that were arriving and that Du Bois was receiving with his essay, there is a choice to be made, right? I mean, you can become native of a place or you can choose to settle, right? And so here you see both that these are very different positionalities, but upon arrival to a particular place, there are political choices to be made. And these political choices may kind of come together with, I mean, against settler colonialism, against the appropriation of land, against the accumulation of nature, etc. And this will be a way of, in a way, enacting universality, aiming to join a community by performing principles of universal emancipation, as opposed to kind of seeking emancipation predicated on land dispossession and settler colonialism. So I hope that helps. I mean, I know it's a lot.
Such an interesting series of points. Or you examine a mid-20th century intellectual discourse that, as we've mentioned now several times, recognized the normative value of both universalism and pluralism, and that was deeply concerned with the question of how to reconcile the particular with the universal in its visions of global order. As you put it, the tension between diversity and unity is a central aspect of the idea of globalism. The thinkers you examine, however, ultimately struggled to resolve that tension, in large part, as you've already discussed, because they did not seriously engage the perspectives that figures like Du Bois were trying to center and amplify during roughly the same time period. But I would be interested to hear what points you feel some of these thinkers like Jacques Maritain and Lewis Mumford, got right. In other words, what insights might we draw from the work of these mid-20th century globalists today as we continue to struggle with the reconciliation of our universal and particular identities and commitments?
Right. So I suppose the link between particularism and universalism in the people I look at is slightly different from what Inés has explored, but in the sense that it doesn't really look, they never really tried to look at questions of identity so much as at questions of motivation. And there is a sense in which these intellectuals were trying to imagine unity as a political aim and to lead people towards action in various ways. So motivated by great visions of urgency, they decided that people really needed to give up on their particularism in order to embrace a kind of a greater cause of some universal transition to a global order. And this kind of leap was the crucial moment in many of their ideas. How do you make people from all over the world accept and, well, passively accept or actively promote a new sense of unity that they thought was urgently needed? So I think this question is something that perhaps we can identify with, or that echoes, our own contemporary needs, especially today as we look at the news and see, the possibility of war getting closer and closer. Now, I think that your choice of two thinkers out of the kind of whole collection of individuals that I discussed in the book really interesting. So you mentioned Jacques Maritain, who was this French Catholic philosopher in exile in the United States during the war, and Lewis Mumford, who's a well-known American thinker, sociologist, urbanist, philosopher. So quite different backgrounds and different ambitions in a way. But interestingly enough, when now in the book, they're not necessarily discussed together, but now that you've mentioned it, I came to think that what really brought them together in the context of global thinking was the notion of faith. And perhaps faith was the kind of connection between the particular and the universal for many promoters of global order in the 1940s. So I'll start with Mumford, who is well known for his theory of the techne and technology. But in 1945, so just after the bomb was dropped on Japan, 2 bombs, he wrote an article that very alarmed at the final doomsday vision of humanity, calling people to unite or perish, and suggesting that the fault was with the experts. So now this is a very contemporary debate again, saying that the colonels, the generals, the politicians, the scientists all had a dose of blame for the devastation that the American bomb caused in Japan. And what was needed was not really for him a new political plan. At this point, what was needed was a leap of faith. So people should unite around this new spiritual concept of the global, and reconnect to this idea of a shared humanity that seems to have been lost, and therefore people could have reached this horrible conclusion of total disaster in Japan. So in that sense, the global was for him not just a political space, but also this kind of spiritual bond between individuals that were united around this cause of imagining a humanity to people around the world. So that was a crucial aspect of his turn to globalism in the 1940s. Now, Maritain came to it from a different perspective. So he was a Thomist. He had long advanced these kind of universalist ideas, imbibed with a sense of Catholic orthodoxy that many of us would not really recognize as fundamental in global political thought. But in fact, as others, including Samoin, have shown, actually pave many of our conceptions of human rights and kind of human unity that we take for granted today. So in a sense, for Maritain, the kind of ideas that could really open the path towards well, first of all, united Europe, which was his first concern, and later a united world. And he was also supportive of this Chicago World Constitution that I've mentioned before. So what was really the foundation for this was faith, ideally Catholicism, but in lack of that, he accepted some kind of pluralism. He considered himself a pluralist. So if not everyone could become Catholic, they should still, everyone should still embrace a sense of shared humanity around this kind of spiritual bond between humans. Now, I find that this is a very interesting conception of the link between particularism and universalism, because it kind of draws on external powers that should provide this link to get out of the negative politics that people insist on perpetuating, leading to devastation. And this is something that a lot of the globalists shared. So how do you overcome humanity's negative traits that lead to division? It's a kind of deus ex machina. In the end, it is faith in religion or in this noble cause of a shared humanity that would get us out of this problem. And I think for many of us today, this may not be enough. We may see this as too abstract and too weak a connection to actually provide substantial ground for global unity. But in the 1940s, this remained an appealing unifier. So the notion that faith could actually bring people together, not only science or technologies, but also faith, giving it a kind of humanizing touch to the kind of global interconnectedness that defined their era, that was one of the main features of the global thinkers that I've explored. And I think it's an interesting question that remains to be asked. What is the sense of faith in today's global thinking? Are we still relying on this idea of shared humanity, or has this been already replaced with a different notion? So I'm not sure I have an answer to that, or that we need an answer. But I think that non-religious faith and spirituality still plays a role in many of these convictions that we need to think about a global order in political terms. So that's something that the 1940s have already done.
I think on a theme so vast, it wouldn't be fitting unless we asked an equally vast and almost unfair question. So I think we'll conclude with a totally unfair, impossible to answer question, but nevertheless, I think it'll be very stimulating. So the theme of this speaker series is identity and belonging in a global age. We chose this theme in part because it seems we find ourselves in a moment in which the notion of identity and as well the notion of the global have become fraught with controversy in public and political discourse. The term global, as we've already discussed, has become something of a dirty word across different circles of Western global society, and often for very good reasons pertaining to the injustice and alienation that characterize so many dimensions of our current economic and political structures. Inversely, however, prevailing notions of identity can often assume that collective identities are inescapably particularistic, oppositional, and therefore somehow fundamentally at odds with the growing consciousness of humanity's oneness and planetary interdependence. So one might therefore say that our prevailing conceptions of both identity and of the global seem inadequate to the present realities and needs of humanity and our increasingly interconnected patterns of life. So then the question we want to ask you, and again, we know that it's beyond your sort of competence to provide the final answer, but we still want to hear what you have to say. So how might we reimagine these notions of identity in the global in such a way that they can more firmly reflect and accommodate our common humanity, as well as the deeply transnational challenges that we face as human beings, yet at the same time without slipping into the homogenizing, oppressive tendencies that have characterized so many of our ostensibly universalist ideas in the past. So,
Okay, so this is really kind of the top question or the driving force behind much of my scholarship. And I've tried to learn from the past mistakes. So one of my ambitions is really not to find examples in history, but to see where people were limited or went wrong. That I find more interesting. So I'm not sure that we can necessarily overcome all of the limitations of past thinkers, but we should nonetheless try, or at least look out for them. And well, I mean, obviously, the first thing that comes to mind from my exploration of global thinkers is that we should really beware of false universalisms, and we should try to position our own ideas in their limited contingent contexts. So to really be aware of what we're trying to do and where we're coming from, which sounds obvious, but I'm not sure that all all the political theorists of the global era are intent on doing that. I became quite suspicious of grand schemes and very attentive to patterns of oppression and domination, which many of my protagonists have ignored. But at the same time, I think that the global order seems to be much more political and politicized than many people want it to look. So this is one thing that I think we should bear in mind, and that in my scholarship I've sought to highlight the kind of implications of power relations and domination in defining even our own identities as individuals, as well as the kind of paths that we choose in life This is something that many people see as, opaque. They just don't notice that. But in fact, that seems to be, to me, very important in trying to understand the ways in which people thought about the global in the past and continue today. And in order for us also to mitigate the negative impact of some of these patterns. So I think that the current debates of world order should include people from different backgrounds, accept diversity, avoid rigid conceptions of unity, and also avoid the kind of ethical relativism that could lead to accepting damaging political positions just in the name of pluralism. So all of these questions were open in the 1940s, and my thinkers were trying to face them. I don't think they necessarily have the final say, but I think we should at least try to avoid repeating the same mistakes. So for me, the question of defining my own identity is really about trying to measure my actions in the context of the global. So to try to figure out not just what I'm doing in my own sort of small political environment, but also to try to understand the greater powers or the greater aspirations that my work can have. As a historian, that's my craft. And in that sense, I think that the future would necessarily entail also reaching beyond into conversations with people whose voices were less heard. So perhaps when I think about the global and about identity, the final kind of aim that I have is to embrace curiosity, to try to find new perspectives that are less oppressive. I think this is an ongoing problem. I don't think it can be resolved in any individual way, but I think that through conversations and highlighting the kind of damaging limitations of past concepts of the global, we can move on towards something more positive. So I'm sorry if my answer is a bit inconclusive, but I think, to have a conclusive answer to this question, that could be quite oppressive in a way. So I like to leave it open and to see that as part of an ongoing debate that people still need to engage with.
Thanks very much, Or. Inés, how would you answer this impossible question?
Here's my effort. So, I think it's good, that I like the provocative articulation of how, the global and identity are very malleable terms, and we're in a particular conjuncture in which they are, they are heavily charged with diverse meanings and also demonized in the case of the global in particular. And I do think that there is a need to rethink them in the face of the current crisis. Even more after yesterday and the events of the last few weeks. And I think I agree with much of what Or said, and I want to echo that, and also expand it by thinking about how transnationalism and also critiques of the imperial character of democracies can help us there. And so first of all, I want to say what I take to be, or at least what I take to be, some features of the of the current crisis, as you referred to. So I'm thinking about anti-globalist reactions that come alongside racist and anti-immigrant narratives that were behind both Brexit as well as the election of Trump in the United States. And I want to also underline the way in which these narratives come coupled with vast systems of state coercion, right? Border fortification by the US Border Patrol in the United States, by Frontex in Europe, as well as increasingly large bureaucracies devoted to immigration detention, the expansion of externalization programs through the Remain in Mexico program in the US, and the many bilateral agreements of externalization with Central America in the case of the US, and with countries in North Africa in the case of, and elsewhere in the case of Europe. So, once we kind of think about not only the narrative, but also kind of the very material implications of those narratives and the way in which these coercive systems have grown in the last few decades. So once setting that up, I want to kind of again get in this terrain. Where my thinking has been kind of dwelling in the last few years after publishing the first book, which is, really to think about the imperial, remnants that we see in Western democracies today. And so, once we do that, I think we get a better kind of view of what are the obstacles of some of our emancipatory languages, in particular the language of popular sovereignty. So what are the obstacles that our emancipatory language puts to imagining the global as a terrain of progressive political action, and also the obstacles that kind of our emancipatory languages pose to mobilizing identities in ways that are not exclusionary and referred to territorial entities. So kind of that is what I'm, where I think we should kind of move, or where we should kind of explore in order to think about the current crisis. And so if popular sovereignty, as I believe, is kind of centrally indebted to moments of enfranchisement that were led by white working classes and that were kind of dependent on existing imperial structures that provided, very explicitly so, provided the material background that allowed for the expansion of democratization and social and economic enfranchisement of white working classes. So there was, empire constituted kind of a realm of imagination and a realm of desire for the very white working classes that were demanding their inclusion, right? Empire made possible the expansion of resources that then allowed for their redistribution among these working classes. And so what was lacking there, and very explicitly and necessarily so, what was lacking was attention to the interconnected subjection of the white working classes that were demanding inclusion and those who were subjected in the colonies, as well in the case of the United States domestically. And so I think that these collective forms of politics that close ranks around the people and disavow their dependence on imperial exploitation is very much a problem that remains today, where kind of these right-wing backlashes are unable to think about their own subjection now to neoliberalism as something that might be kind of share commonalities with other forms of subjection, and instead kind of, again, close ranks, close borders in order to shelter themselves without considering these kind of broader interrelations and interconnections. And so another way of putting this is to say that popular sovereignty tends towards closure, and we urgently need a political language that doesn't seek the closure, but really contributes to openings towards the world. And this would mean to recognize the historical moment in which we find ourselves, ponder very carefully how neoliberalism excels at relying on historical racial divides, as well as creating new forms of racialized difference that can exploit, with the aid of coercive states, in order to kind of survive, reproduce, and accumulate. And so I guess my call would be, and again, I cannot even hope to answer that big question, but my more minimalistic call would be to really kind of a politics of refusal, refusal of these kind of privatized modes of existence under which, or that represent well-being in our day, right? What is it that we aspire to become? So this privatized mode of existence, or this privatized kind of family existence, the family with the Amazon box outside. That's what when I think about privatized family existence, I think about the suburban house with the Amazon box outside. But this But I think that this is what needs to be refused in order to think about a politics of well-being that is kind of more broadly attached to community and through community to potentially expanding waves of interconnection and understanding of how our particular predicament is not limited, is not unique, but it's rather kind of one aspect of a broader transnational kind of network of injustice. So it goes without saying that the effort today is exactly the opposite. I mean, it's to close ourselves to difference and to history, to ban books that might enlighten us about it, to deny the legitimacy of the Black and Latinx vote that defeated Trump in Georgia and Arizona, and to declare illegal the mobilities produced by the dark side of imperial political projects in the global South. But there is also resistance and a clear effort to track continuities between Black lives lived in many areas of the metropole, as well as anti-neoliberal revolts in Chile, as well as in Lebanon. So I just want to kind of offer that, and really, I mean, I would love to continue the conversation about this. But I mean, in closing, I'll just say that what brought me to transnationalism as a lens, as a frame, was the ability to map these particular continuities that I'm talking about, that are about globalism and are about identity, but are also about kind of opening kind of the community based on these interconnections rather than closing it off because of fear or threat or just sheer possessiveness.
Thank you. You did a terrific job with what Ben characterized as an impossible question. We do have a few minutes left, and I do want to sneak in one question. But did you want to respond to that in any way?
I just want to follow Inés. Really, I just want to join her in this in this vision. I love. I think that this is really.
Oh, we lost you.
Think crucially about.
Or could you rewind?
Sorry, yeah, my internet
rewind
is a bit
maybe
glitchy.
4 seconds.
Yeah. So
before you started your thought, because we'd love to hear it.
So I was saying that I loved Inés' vision, and I think that it is a crucial way, especially as an invitation for people to stop and think about what is the way in which they want to live as individuals now. Not to define our identities, but as you say, what we buy, where we live, and especially not by where we were born and what kind of citizenships we have. This is something that I have been personally, trying to do, and to connect that with a kind of critical thought about the global as constructive space, rather than an abstract capitalist space. That would really be, an achievement. I think that this is something that needs to be collectively done with people from different parts of the world. But yeah, I'm definitely on board with the vision that Inés outlined, and I think that historians have a role in that, in trying to figure out how to connect our variously different pasts into some kind, of a common future. It sounds banal, but it's extremely difficult. So I hope that we can, give a hand and do that.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that invitation to reimagine the global and the notion of identity. We just have a few minutes left, and you've both made references to the projects you're working on now. So I would love to just get a brief overview from you about what's currently on your intellectual horizon. What have you been working on since the publication of these books, and what do you see yourself devoting your intellectual energies to in the coming months and years? Inés, perhaps you could start.
Sure. So I actually, my book was just submitted and it's under review. So it's very fresh. I mean, this was last week. Last week? Yes, last week. Yeah, so I mean, the book is tentatively titled Democracy and Empire, and it's precisely looking at popular sovereignty, as I was referring to in my last answer. And also, I mean, I coupled popular sovereignty with a particular form of self-determination that I call self and other determination. And my goal is to think about how discussions about popular sovereignty and discussions about self-determination are kind of so, I mean, not engaged with from the literature on empire. And what you have is that you cannot connect the very kind of entangled way in which discourses of emancipation developed in the context of empire and depended on kind of the appropriation of resources by empires in order to enfranchise white working classes in the West. And so that's kind of, the theoretical setup. I mean, that's kind of the critique and the two literatures that I bring together. And the book is very indebted to racial capitalism, or race and capitalism as a tradition. So in the Black radical tradition. So I do return to Du Bois, although I focus much more on his kind of his Marxism, or his Black Marxism rather. And I bring in other thinkers. So Fanon, Franz Fanon, and Saidiya Hartman kind of are great interlocutors to think about change. So moments of supposedly emancipation, or Fanon would say partial liberation, in order kind of to track this transformation from the moment, these kind of historical moments of declarations of peoplehood that I was referring to, and how do this evolve and kind of remain within our democratic discourse, and provide a way to read kind of these backlashes, these racist backlashes that we've been experiencing. But then the second part of the book actually tries to look more closely at kind of, to the extent that I'm arguing that popular sovereignty has this kind of material underpinnings that is provided by empire. I do look at first the question of social reproduction from, I mean, I focus on kind of a portion of it in the sense that I focus on, I mean, what I call the Brown family, which is not the family that, I mean, that's not the surname, but it's actually thinking about kind of the relationship between the US and Mexico, and how conquest followed by irregular migration, followed by Abracero program, followed by mass surveillance today. You can track kind of this very close entanglement between the US and Mexico, and more recently Central American migrants and refugees, as kind of a way of organizing the social reproduction of these privatized families. So that's why the privatized families were, popping out in my answer. And then the very last chapter, I shouldn't say it's the second to last, actually looks to another material underpinning, which is basically the environment. And here it's one of my favorite kind of rereadings of Du Bois, in the sense that I look at Du Bois and how he really looks at nature and manual labor, particularly racialized manual labor, and how they together kind of sustain this kind of splendorous high technology society that perhaps, I mean, some of these, elite globalists were so enthralled with. And so it's a really, I mean, it was really a fantastic kind of discovery to see in Du Bois's development, writings on development, to see really how he was focusing on manual labor and nature as presuppositions for kind of Western society and its technological wonder. So I sorry, I took too much time. I want to give some time to Or, but yeah, that's kind of what is keeping me busy these days.
Thank you. Or?
Right. So I'm writing quite a different project now. So it's a book called Air and Love, and it will come out with Picador in the UK in a couple of years. So it's meant for a wider audience, and it tells the story of migrants over the last 150 years and their food. So it basically takes the reader from Central Asia to Northern Europe, the Baltics, the Russian Empire and the Mediterranean, tracing few families of migrants, especially women whose voices are often excluded, and trying to recreate this identity of people on the move, trying to think about refugees, travelers, migrants, and how they shaped the world in which we live. and how their own lives were influenced by political transformations on which they had no influence. So this book is really about my own family, as well as millions of other people who were forced to move or chose to, and they made the world we live in. So it really touches on your theme of identity and the global in a very kind of personal way. And I look forward to share it with you in a couple of years. I'll be interested in what you have to say about that.
We will look forward to that. Or Rosenboim, Inés, Valdez, such a rich and illuminating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It was tremendously interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us. Yeah, this was great.
Thank you. We'd also like to thank our sponsors again, the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Please note that our conversation with Arturo Escobar and Glenn Coulthard, who was referenced in today's conversation, originally scheduled for March 25th, has been rescheduled for Thursday, May 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern. A new registration link for that event will be posted shortly. And of course, that means that the next event in our series will take place on Friday, April 22nd, again at 3 p.m. Eastern, when Ben and I will have the great pleasure of welcoming Barbara Fields and Derek Smith to discuss identity, justice, and the future of race. We hope to see you all then. Thanks again.
Thank you.